Hello and welcome back to the breadboarding tutorial series. In the previous video, we discussed how to set up the circuit for the T-SIC and the Dallas. In this video, we're going to be talking about the safety of soldering, as well as actually soldering to our boards, as well as soldering our sensors into wires. So before we begin, quickly to mention that soldering can be quite dangerous. With the soldering iron, this thing can get very, very hot. You don't want to be touching or poking at the end of this when it's turned on because it can in fact burn straight through the gloves which you should be wearing regardless. Secondly, when soldering, you must make sure that you use as little solder as possible. This just means that you get a better connection and it just means that your solders look nicer overall. So, with all this being said, let's move over to the video. What you can see in front of you just now is what we'd have set up for soldering. Just off to the left hand side here is the soldering iron. And as you can see, we've got quite a sharp point here. This is where we will actually have the solder connection to the board. What I have to the right of our solder is this gold foil. We use this gold foil to scrub off any excess solder from our solder wire, and this just means that we won't get the end of this any dirtier, and it just means that it will actually solder properly. Then again on the left hand side in the box which holds the soldering iron, we have this sponge here. We use the sponge before we use the foil to clear off any of the more moist solder, and this just allows us to again keep the solder clean. We then also have this. This is a solder remover. It's quite easy to use it. You'd simply push in this button here. It can be awkward with gloves, but once you push that in and hear the click, that's it ready to go. Simply to use it, you would heat up your solder that's already on your board, hold this quite close to it, and then press in the button. This bit pops back up and the excess solder is put into the tube where you can click it out and you're ready to go again. Before starting, we do have our small box on the left hand side just out of view of the camera. This is where the power for the solder comes from. Before powering your solder, you just always make sure that the dial is set to the lowest value, which has got an orange ring for 200 degrees Celsius. If it's set to there, you can safely power on the button at the right hand side of the box, and then you'll twist the dial until your solder reaches about 400 degrees Celsius. You then have to wait for the light to start flashing. We currently have a steady red. This is just the solder heating up, and we will wait until it gives us a steady, consistent blinking, which can generally take about 10 to 30 seconds. So that's us. We now have our steady blinking light and we are ready to solder. So before we begin to solder, what we're going to do is we have to set up for holding our soldering wire. Since I'm left-handed, I'm going to hold the solder wire in my right hand. I'm going to just clasp the loose solder with my third, fourth and fifth finger like this. This keeps the excess solder away from the rest of where we're actually soldering, and I'm going to pinch about just over an inch away from the end of the solder with my thumb and index finger like this. This means that I can use this part to solder, and then once this bit is used, I just feed this through and I've got more to use. We're then going to pick up our soldering iron, which is heated up. I'm just going to move this bit of solder out of the way, and I'm going to take this wire here and I'm going to feed this through our board. We're just using the board to be able to hold our wire. I'm just going to have to let go of the solder for a second. I'm just going to put this wire into the board and we're going to make our solder connection from the wire to this piece of copper. So our wire is now contained on the board. I'm going to pick back up our solder, again clamping and going about an inch away from the end. I'm going to pick up my soldering iron, and all you have to do is hold the tip of the soldering iron quite close to the hole on the board, and you're just going to you're going to have to heat up the metal of the wire and the board. Then you just gently push the solder towards it and it should kind of act as a glue. Once you get that connection, some of it will start to melt and you just want to melt it around the wire. So that's a fairly poor connection there, but what you can do is you can keep it heated up and just drag it around. As you can see, my wire is now connected to my board with this little metal sheet around it connecting it. I'm going to, as I've said, I'm going to just scrape off the excess solder using our sponge, and then I'm going to take our gold foil here and I'm just going to scrape. This cleans our solder, ready for our next one. And just to demonstrate what we've actually done, now our wire is quite securely locked to our board. You would then take a pair of wire cutters and you would just snip off this extra wire just to keep your board quite tidy. So I'm going to bring this up and I'm going to cut quite close to my solder, probably about here. And as you can see, we've now got a very neat connection to our board with nothing else in the way. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to show you a slightly more difficult solder, which is wire-to-wire soldering. This is more challenging because you have to get the solder to come along the wire to get more connections. For this demonstration, I've got this sad little Dallas sensor here that's probably going to get destroyed. When you're soldering your sensors, you don't actually want to be destroying them. You just want to make sure that you get just the right heat and just the right connection. I'm going to remove the board from our clips here, and I'm going to use one of them to clamp the end of our wire, as so. Then I'm going to take one of the other legs of our Dallas here, and I'm going to clamp this on the other side. So I'm just going to bend that further away and clamp down. There we go. I'm then going to take the leg that we're soldering to and bring it further out, and I'm going to move the clips so that these run parallel to one another. You need to keep them quite close so you can actually get the connection, and a good rule of thumb when soldering directly onto your sensor is to keep it probably about 5mm away from the sensor so you don't actually damage the sensor as much. We're then going to begin our solder once again, so we're going to get our solder back into our hand, pick up our soldering iron, and we are just going to gently heat up these wires with our solder next to it. So again, we're going to use this almost like our glue, and then we just need to make sure that this connects along our wire. As you see, what's happening here is we're just making a long connection across our wires. The more connection points that your wire has to your sensor means that you'll get more electric current being able to flow through, since there's more points for the electrons to carry across, which means that you'll get a stronger electrical signal between the sensor and your board. So as you can see, we now have our wire quite neatly soldered onto our wire here. If I just take this out of our clips just to show you the closer up, you should be able to see there that we've got a very nice connection between our wires. What will happen now is you would have your sensors quite far away from your board, as this negates the rest of the circuit from giving you any poor readings for your temperature. So that brings us to the end of our soldering. So in the next video, we are going to be discussing how to use the heat shrink. The heat shrink is essentially a glorified hairdryer, which allows you to put some plastic tubing around your solders and gives you a better connection overall. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.